Hi everyone. So, today in the world of Formula One, we've received some sad but ultimately not unexpected news that Sebastian Vettel has announced his retirement at the end of 2023. I felt like I should say something because I've been supporting him ever since he started, really. And so this video is completely unscripted. I maybe later in the year I'll probably do a proper biography video about him, similar to all my other ones, but I thought maybe I'll just get something out now and we can just talk about him and talk about his career a bit, kind of podcast style. So Vettel was always destined for greatness, really. I mean, he started karting very young. When he was 11, he got picked up by the Red Bull Junior Academy, which pretty much set him up from there on, because then when he moved up to single-seaters in 2003 when he was 16, and managed to win Formula BMW ADAC in 2004, and he won 18 of the 20 races that year, so he clearly proved he was the real deal. That actually was his only title in single-seaters before Formula One, because he went to the Formula 3 Euro Series after that, and he was runner-up in 2006, and then he was partway through his campaign in 2007 when he got called up to Formula One, because he was called in at first. He had been, since 2006, he had been BMW Sauber's reserve driver, and so when he debuted for them at the Turkish Grand Prix in 2006 in Friday practice, he became the youngest ever driver at a Formula One weekend, as he would have only been 18 or 19 at the time. But then after Kubica's enormous crash at Canada in 2007, Vettel was called up to replace him for Indianapolis. And he did very well because he managed to qualify in Q3. And even if at the start he cut across the grass, he made a couple of good overtakes and he finished 8th and scored a point on his debut. A couple of races after that, Scott Speed at Toro Rosso got fired. And so Vettel was brought in from the Hungarian Grand Prix onwards to replace him. And so now had a full-time seat, which again was with Toro Rosso, which is what you would have expected as a Red Bull Junior driver. At first, he wasn't really. He was driving fairly averagely. It was a backmarker car, and so he was running around in the back and the lower midfield. But then at Fuji, the rain poured down, and he managed to get himself up into a podium spot. And after Alonso crashed out and the safety car was out, he found himself in third place behind Lewis Hamilton and Mark Webber. However, a misjudgment with the braking and the weaving meant that he crashed into Webber behind the safety car and took both of them out. And bear in mind that Webber was driving for his senior team Red Bull, and he had just taken away what would have been the best result for both Toro Rosso and Red Bull. So that was not a good look. And Webber himself was not very happy about that. But then the following race in China, he managed to go from 16th or 17th all the way up to 4th, again in the rain. And that was key, because as well as that, his teammate at the time, Tonio Luzzi, finished 6th. And so that meant they went from last in the Constructors' Championship up to 7th, and that really saved them. So he stayed with Toro Rosso in 2008, and he was now with Sebastian Bourdais, who was a 4-time Champ Car champion. This is actually when I first noticed him, because I started watching F1 full-time in 2008, after watching the Bahrain Grand Prix. And I decided to support him. I was a Lewis Hamilton supporter, but I decided to support him because he was at the bottom of the standings, because he was in a first lap crash in Australia, the car broke down in Malaysia, then he was in another first lap crash in Bahrain, and then another one in Spain. So he, after 4 races, he hadn't yet seen the checkered flag. He finally did in Turkey, but then at Monaco, they gave him a new car, the STR3, just a rebadged Red Bull RB4. And then he finished 5th in the rain at Monaco. And after this started coming a string of Q3 appearances and points finishes, and Sebastian Bourdais just wasn't able to match it, and people were really starting to notice him at this point. And then his breakthrough came at Monza, where they went for a low downforce setup, even though it had been torrential rain all weekend and very little practice running. And he managed to get on pole position, with Bourdais in 3rd or 4th, I think. Meanwhile, Ferrari and McLaren were somewhere in the midfield, so it was a very jumbled up grid. And he went on to win that race, having led every lap, and became the youngest race winner in Formula One history. And that was just amazing to watch, because it was a midfield car, and the only other people to have won races that year, as is mostly the case, were front runners. So I was really I was really blown away by that, and it was obvious that he was a star of the future. At this point, he had already signed for Red Bull for the following year to go alongside Mark Webber. And fortunately for them, the new technical regulations benefited them a lot, with Adrian Newey designing their car. And so go 2009, suddenly he's in a front-running car, and he qualifies at the front alongside Brawn GP, who were a backmarker team Honda in Australia. And he was running in second for most of the race, and then was being caught by Kubica, and then they collided on the penultimate lap, and Vettel tried to continue on three wheels but had to stop. So that obviously did not help, because Button then won it. And then again in Malaysia, he spun and stalled the car when the rain poured down just before the race was red flagged, and again that was won by Button, so that put him behind. But then China was another wet race, and he went on to comfortably win that. And so that was his second win. It was the first ever win for Red Bull. Outside of that, all the other early races were won by Jenson Button, and he crashed out in Monaco, and he broke down in Valencia. So there were loads of problems, both in terms of himself making rookie mistakes, and also unreliability with the car were really hampering him. In the second half of the year, though, Brawn GP slowed down a lot, and Red Bull did have the fastest car, and also McLaren and Ferrari had improved a lot. And so he started winning a few more races, and Brawn GP weren't really, and Button didn't win any more outside of the first 7 that year. But it was too little too late, and he ended up being runner-up in the championship that year. And obviously, at the time, you think, well, that could be your last chance. Fortunately, Red Bull were still front-runners in 2010, when now we had more new regulations, because now we had a new points system, and they banned refueling in the cars. And so that changed the race strategies a lot. 2010 started a bit shakily, because he got pole at the first race and was leading it, but then he lost a cylinder in the engine and ended up dropping down to 4th. And then in Australia, again, he got pole and he was leading it, and then the brakes failed and he spun off into the gravel. So he'd already lost a ton of points from that. But he won in Malaysia, and from here on was consistently running at the front. The first major moment major bad moment and the first major moment of tension in the team was at Turkey, when he was battling for the lead with teammate Webber, and he ended up turning in on him, and they famously collided, and Webber could carry on, but Vettel was now out, and naturally he blamed Webber for it. And at the time I wanted to blame Webber because I was a bit of a Vettel stan and whatnot, but looking back you can see that's Vettel turning in on him before he's passed him, and that gave McLaren a 1-2. So that was not a good look for them, and that created a lot of tension in the team. But after that, he got a string of pole positions, but only won one other race, which was the European Grand Prix. And then in the summer break, he had a very poor Belgian Grand Prix, which had started wet and was drying, and he ended up losing control and colliding with Jenson Button trying to pass him at the bus stop chicane. Button retired, Vettel carried on, but then he pitted and he dropped down, and then trying to pass another car, he got a puncture and then had to do a whole lap with a puncture and then pitted again, and so finished well outside the points. But then towards the end of the year, he came back incredibly strongly. He got pole and won in Japan. He was leading in Korea, but then the car broke down with only a few laps to go. By this point, Webber was leading the championship, but he crashed out only a few laps in, so that helped him. But Alonso won it, who would become his main rival. But then he won in Brazil, and then going into Abu Dhabi, he was one of 4 drivers who were in contention for the title. And he got pole, and he comfortably led the race, and was very lucky that Webber and Alonso both tried to pit early, and they ended up getting stuck behind Vitaly Petrov for the entire race, which meant they couldn't advance. And so by winning, he had managed to win the championship, and he became Formula One's youngest champion, and still is Formula One's youngest champion at just 23 years of age. So he goes into 2011 at Red Bull, and now they have there are some new rules, because we now have KERS and DRS on the cars. Bridgestone have been replaced with Pirelli as the official tyre supplier, who deliberately created high degradation tyres, because in 2010 we'd had a lot of drivers that would pit on the first or the last lap just to get the mandatory pit stop in, because the tyres could last pretty much forever. And Red Bull themselves, they'd also created their innovative off-throttle exhaust-blown diffuser, which meant that he was basically unstoppable. I mean, for the first 9 or so races, he finished first or second in every race. His only major error came at the Canadian Grand Prix, which he had been leading comfortably, but then on the last lap he was being hounded by Jenson Button, who'd been through the pit lane several times and had loads of problems, and then he runs wide and gives the lead up to Button, and who takes the win. But other than that, he finished off the podium only once, and then in Japan he finished third, but he successfully defended the title with only 4 races to go, which was one of the highest, because before that they'd had things like Schumacher in 2002 with 6 races left, and again Nigel Mansell in 1992 with 6 races. And his only retirement late in the year was Abu Dhabi, where he suffered a suspension failure coming out of turn 1, which again he was on pole and probably would have won. But he scored almost 400 points, and it was a very easy run to the championship for him. 2012 was immediately there were problems in testing, and the car just wasn't anywhere near as dominant in the first couple of races. It was much closer with McLaren in particular, and also with Ferrari. In only the second race in Malaysia, he had a coming together with Narain Karthikeyan when lapping him, which gave him a puncture and dropped him out of the points. And afterwards, there was a famous spat with him and Karthikeyan where he called him an idiot, and then he called him a cucumber, which I don't know what that means. And Karthikeyan called him a crybaby and that. But other than that, it was so close at the front, and there were 7 different winners in the first 7 races, that he only won in Bahrain before the summer break. At the European Grand Prix in Valencia, he was leading really comfortably. Like, he was getting like a second a lap on everybody. And then after the safety car, he then had an alternator failure and retired from the lead, and the win went to Alonso, who was now some 40 points ahead in the championship. And then in Germany, his home race, he had finished on the podium, but because he had gone off track to pass Jenson Button, he got penalised and dropped to 5th, so that didn't help him. In the second half of the year, he got very lucky because he didn't qualify well in Spa, but then Grosjean took out Hamilton and Alonso, his 2 main title rivals at the start, and he went on to finish second. He broke down right at the end of Italy and got no points, but then he was back with a vengeance, and he won the next 4 races on the trot, and put himself right back in the game. At Abu Dhabi, he qualified at the front, but then he was excluded from qualifying because he didn't have enough fuel in the car, so he had to start from the pit lane. But despite that, he climbed through the field twice because there was a safety car he pitted and dropped back, and he also ran through a DRS board, and he eventually managed to finish in 3rd and got the fastest lap, having started 23rd. And then in the United States, he was leading it and he got pole, but then he got caught by Lewis Hamilton at the end and finished 2nd. However, going into the final round, it was between him and Alonso. He didn't have a particularly good start, and then at Deshida de Lago, he got spun round and got damage to his floor and side pods, but he just about managed to keep going. And the rain was coming down, and he was climbing his way through the field, but then the rain stopped, which slowed him down again, and he started going backwards, and then he lost the radio, and he made a pit call that the team were not expecting because obviously they couldn't communicate with him, and that slowed him down enormously. But even so, he managed to finish 6th, which was just enough for him to take his 3rd title. 2013, things were beginning to get a bit weary now because people were getting sick of seeing a 3-time champion, and he was annoying a lot of people because he could be a bit childish, and he's starting to get booed at races as well. But he started the year, finished 3rd in Australia, then in Malaysia, he was behind teammate Mark Webber, but even though he was ordered to hold position, he still very riskily passed him and took the lead and the win, which led to Webber's famous exchange of multi-21 in the cool-down room. And so at that point, Webber had basically just given up, and so he made his decision to retire at the end of the year. And Vettel initially apologised for this and then redacted that, and it later came out that the reason he had disobeyed the orders was punishment basically for Webber compromising his start at Brazil, which nearly cost him the championship. So no love lost there. Other than that, it was fairly close in the first half. There were a few other winners here and there. He was leading in Silverstone after several other drivers had these weird tyre blowouts, but then he had a gearbox failure and retired, which was his only retirement that year. But then after the summer break, he set a new record by getting 9 consecutive wins. And so at the Indian Grand Prix, he then won his 4th consecutive title with 3 rounds to go. and so it just looked like he was on top of the world, and everyone was wondering, is there any way of stopping him? Fortunately, for those that did want him to be stopped, there were brand new regulations coming in 2014. Now, the aerodynamics were being changed up, and they're replacing the V8s with turbocharged hybrid V6s. And this created a big switch because it immediately meant Mercedes now had the fastest car. Red Bull had massive problems in testing, mostly with the engine, and he retired at the first race, and beyond that was struggling to get on the podium, and his new teammate Daniel Ricciardo was routinely beating him. And across that year, he only got on the podium 4 times, whereas Ricciardo won 2 races. But at the Japanese Grand Prix, he announced that he was going to move to Ferrari for 2015, and he found basically a clause in his Red Bull contract that allowed him to get out early, because I think he decided enough is enough, and he knew the car wasn't there. Like, the aerodynamics were perfectly good, but the engine just wasn't up to scratch. So 2015, and now he's at Ferrari. This season, I think, is massively underrated because he drove exceptionally for pretty much the entire year. It was quite a boring season overall. There's not really much to say about it because Mercedes were just so far ahead of everyone else. But he was, more often than not, just behind them, and there if they slipped up to get past them and take the win. He won 3 races. Malaysia, so that was his first win for Ferrari and only his second race with them. They just got a better strategy and beat Mercedes. Hungary, everyone had a bit of a dodgy race because this was the same week that Bianchi had died, and so I think that was on people's minds a bit. And then Singapore, he got the only non-Mercedes pole position that year. Hamilton retired, and so he went on to win that one. At this point, he was basically out of the title fight because up until then he had just about clung on. But at Belgium, he ran a really, really long second stint, but then had a tyre blowout on the penultimate lap when he was running in 3rd place. At that point, that was pretty much the end of his charge. Hamilton won the title at the United States Grand Prix, but at that point, Vettel was actually ahead of Nico Rosberg in the standings, which just shows just how consistent he was. 2016 didn't work so well. They ended up, Ferrari, him and Kimi Raikkonen, they didn't win any races that year. There were several they could have, but again, Mercedes was so far ahead. And the only races that Mercedes didn't win were won by Red Bull, who they were fighting more closely with. And he also had his first failed race start when his engine died on the way round on the formation lap at the Bahrain Grand Prix. 2017, things changed a bit. There were new regulations now that had widened and enlarged the tyres and widened the front wings and the aerodynamics just to increase downforce and basically make the cars faster, but also making them hard to overtake. Ferrari now had a car that could match Mercedes properly, and so he finished first or second in the first 6 races. At Azerbaijan, behind the safety car, he thought he got brake tested by Lewis, and so he drove into the side of him and then got penalised for this, which obviously wasn't a good look and was the beginning of their kind of rivalry between them. At the British Grand Prix, he had a tyre blowout near the end, which dropped him down off the podium to 7th, which didn't help him. At this point, Hamilton has started to climb back up and get who had quite a shaky start, but Vettel was still very much in the title fight. However, he made a major error at the Singapore Grand Prix because he qualified on pole and Hamilton was all the way down in 5th. But then at the start, Raikkonen had a far better start than he expected him to, and so he turned in and squeezed Raikkonen against Verstappen, and so that took both of them out on the spot. And then Vettel himself had damage to the radiators, and so he spun a couple of corners later. And so that meant that Hamilton went from 5th to 1st in about 3 corners and went on to win the race. Then, after this, he just didn't really get a chance to fight back properly, because at Malaysia, he had to start at the back of the grid, and he managed to finish 4th after all that, and set the fastest lap, and then collided with Lance Stroll after the race had finished, which was a very bizarre accident. And then Japanese Grand Prix, the car breaks down only a couple of laps in, Lewis wins it, and so he's lost more than well over 50 points in 3 races, and that basically destroyed his title charge. It came down to the Mexican Grand Prix. He collided with Hamilton at the start. He got wing damage and Hamilton got a puncture, and it put them both down at the back. He climbed up to fourth, but Hamilton still won the title. 2018, they were both 4-time champions, so this was the battle for 5, essentially. And again, it started in a very similar manner because he started really strongly. He won the first 2 races. He got hit by Verstappen in China when he could have finished on the podium, and that cost him a lot of points. Azerbaijan, after the safety car restart, he locked up trying to pass Bottas, lost several places, and then Bottas got a puncture and retired, and then Hamilton won. And if without that lockup, he could have then won it. At the French Grand Prix, he collided with Bottas at the start and finished 5th. The Austrian Grand Prix saw Hamilton's only retirement that year, and he only managed to finish 3rd. He did manage to win in Silverstone in a very convincing fashion, but then it all came undone again at Germany. He was leading the race. He had spent a large part of it stuck behind Raikkonen, because Ferrari have always been a bit funny about team orders and general strategy, and eventually got past him. And then when the rain started coming down, he spun off and into the barriers just before the safety car was going to come out anyway. And that gave the lead to Lewis, who had started 14th, and then he took the win. And so that didn't destroy his title chances, but it made it very difficult. He won in Belgium, but other than that, didn't win any further races. And he spun in Italy at the start with Lewis, and then he spun again in Japan, and then again in the United States. And then at it was a Mexican Grand Prix again where Hamilton won the title. And so this time it wasn't reliability, it was just his own errors that had really cost him the title. And he could have and should have won it that year because he had the fastest car, but he just cracked under the pressure of Lewis, who particularly in the second half of the season is so strong and so difficult to beat. 2019, he has a new teammate in Charles Leclerc. Early on, it becomes clear the car is not as fast as it was. They're now more around Red Bull speed, and Mercedes are just getting 1-2 after 1-2 finish. And he's also finding himself being beaten by Leclerc a lot of the time. At Canada, he led the race, but then he had Lewis on his tail, and he went off and rejoined the track right in front of him, and then got a 5-second penalty, which meant that even though he finished first on track, he was classified in second. However, he had his first badass moment where he parked up early and then just walked over to where the cars are meant to be and just moved the first and second place slots around. And he was obviously very unhappy. A lot of people were very unhappy with that ruling. After that, the mistakes and the spinning had just crept in, because again, he'd spun again in Bahrain, and then in Silverstone, he collided with Max Verstappen while battling with him. But at Germany, he had actually an exceptionally good race, and I think made up for the previous year, because it was a wet race, and he was starting at the back, and he managed to finish second, and he was the only driver who didn't spin or go off track the entire race. And he came within 5 seconds of winning, not only his home race, but winning from last place. And so that was one of his best performances that wasn't a win, certainly. Italy was one of his worst races because Leclerc won it, and he spun again, and when rejoining the track he almost took out Lance Stroll, and yeah, that was just a real amateur moment for him. He managed to win in Singapore actually by undercutting Leclerc. Leclerc was very unhappy because I think as far as he was concerned he was supposed to be winning it, and of course this is when Ferrari were having their illegal engine phase. And again, Russia, he qualified third, but he took the lead at the start, which evidently Ferrari were not expecting, because only a few laps in, they were asking him to give the lead up to Leclerc, even though he was like about 3 seconds ahead of Leclerc, who had Lewis right behind him. So he obviously disobeyed this. But then the car broke down, which created a virtual safety car, which timed perfectly with Hamilton's pit stop, which meant he took the lead from Leclerc and then won it. And so that put an end to any attempts that Ferrari really had to challenge. And then in Japan, he jumped the start and then lost out from that and finished second. And then after that, they got found out about their illegal engine maps, and so they had to get rid of them, and then they went back to just being like third fastest, basically. He got suspension damage at Kota, and then in Brazil, he collided with Leclerc, which in an almost identical fashion to the way he collided with Webber in 2010. So again, it was just a year of constant errors, and he just didn't seem to be able to shake them. most of 2020 was basically a write-off. I mean, the car was just awful. It was just it was a midfield car, and you could see that he was beginning to care less and less, and Ferrari were just throwing him under the bus, and they were not very impressed. He had one very good race, though, at Turkey, where, again, it was a wet race, and he was the only driver who didn't spin or go off track, and he managed to finish third at the end. So that was a very good performance, another very good wet weather performance. But he got dropped at the end of the year and moved on to Aston Martin, and you could see at this point he was beginning to care less because he didn't have the car under him that he wanted. And now also all of the We Racers 1 stuff had started, and he was getting very passionate, particularly about the environmentalism. And we've seen that since he moved to Aston Martin, where he's often wearing T-shirts with certain messages on them and doing a lot of campaigning outside of racing. And there's not much to say really about the last 2 years in terms of his driving, because it's been very up and down, and he's had the odd fantastic race here and there, such as Baku and Hungary last year, where he was on the podium. Of course, he got disqualified in Hungary, but could have won it. And then you also get races like Australia this year, where he missed the first 2 races because of COVID, and then in Australia the car kept breaking down. He crashed 2 or 3 times as well. And you can see that he's just losing his passion for it. I mean, particularly his response after finding out in the media pen in Austria that he'd been disqualified and dropped from 15th to 17th. You could see he just didn't care. He was like, well, I was out of the points anyway, so what does it matter? So yeah, I was kind of expecting this announcement. I thought it was unlikely that he would continue any further because he just seems to not have that same drive anymore, and you don't blame him really with the kind of cars he's having to drive now. And he has obviously his passions outside of it, which happens with a lot of the older drivers. I mean, we've seen obviously Lewis has an endless list of passions outside of Formula One, but because he still has access to a race-winning car, he's still able to drive at the top of his game and keep performing. So there's no reason for him to stop anytime soon. But yeah, for Vettel, I think his time is coming to an end. He hasn't really been at his best for a very long time, which is a shame, because when he was at his best, he was basically unbeatable. I mean, he's an incredibly well-rounded driver, always been incredibly fast, exceptionally good in qualifying. Racecraft, maybe it's because I'm British and he competing against Lewis, and people are always accusing him that he can't overtake. He's proven time and time again he can, and again he's been in collisions with other drivers a lot, but who hasn't, basically, as an F1 driver? As he's got older, he's obviously matured in his racecraft. I mean, it was interesting seeing, particularly with Ferrari, because their strategy team seemed to just have lentils for brains, is that he would be there trying to drive the car himself and also basically explaining to them what strategy they should be doing, because they don't seem to be able to work it out themselves. He has that mature wisdom that you see in drivers like Hamilton and Alonso that have obviously been doing this for a very long time. And he ends his career with as of today, 53 wins. Who knows, there may be another one before the season ends. 4 championships. As one of the most experienced drivers, he's in the top 10 certainly. I mean, he does end his career on 299 race starts, which just kind of drives me nuts a bit, because it's the same as Raikkonen retiring on 349, and then going back even further back, Jackie Stewart retired on 99 starts, and obviously his reasons for not doing the final race were perfectly legitimate, but still, it just kind of sets my OCD off a bit. But obviously after he's left, he's not going to just disappear into obscurity. I mean, as of yesterday, he has Instagram, and before that, he was the only F1 driver since social media was invented to not have social media. That should have been the giveaway, really. I saw the announcement was coming and I didn't think, oh, it must be his retirement. I thought it was going to be something to do with campaigning. But yeah, he'll keep himself busy. I mean, I'm hoping that he'll stick around the paddock, and it would be nice to see him do a bit of analysis and punditry work in a similar way that Rosberg does. I think that would be quite fun. But yeah, he leaves the sport as one of the greats, and as certainly one of the most popular drivers, and one that has made a real impact on the sport and has the potential to make impact in many other areas as well. So yeah, I think I've rambled on about as much as I can. yeah, just thought it'd be a bit fun to talk about him a bit in kind of a podcast sense and get a bit of discussions going about him and what people's favourite memories are and what they think of him as a driver. So yeah, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Brook_F1. A huge shout out and thank you to my Patreon subscribers Alex Forstermans, Ypsilon2643 and Valentine Frank. And I'll see you all next time.